Hey folks, buckle in, because tonight we're diving headfirst into one of history's most absurd, chaotic, yet strangely heartwarming traditions, the Renaissance-era Village Festival. Think of it as the ultimate neighborhood gathering, part trade fair, part livestock parade, part medieval soap opera, all wrapped in questionable hygiene and an alarming amount of cheese. Before we leap into this glorious mess of jugglers, merchants, overcooked stews, and goats that definitely didn't sign up for this, do me a quick favor. If you love wandering down the weird alleys of history as much as I do, hit that subscribe button. It lets me know I'm not just yelling about goats into the void. And hey, drop a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. You'd be amazed how global these ridiculous stories can be. Now dim those lights, maybe grab your most suspicious-looking snack, and let's drift together into a world where entertainment was homemade, the ale was potent, and if you weren't careful, you might accidentally end up in a duel over a particularly handsome sheep. Let's begin. Imagine waking up in a thatched cottage nestled along the banks of a sleepy, moss-covered creek. It's the year 1527, and your primary concerns in life revolve around not starving, not freezing, and hopefully not stepping in something suspicious on your way to milk the goats. But today is special. Today is the Autumn Market Festival, the one time a year when the entire village of Elderbrook transforms from a quiet farming community into an unruly carnival of questionable craftsmanship, enthusiastic merchants, and stories that'll fuel the town's gossip for months. There were no printed flyers, no town criers shouting about the festivities ahead of time, unless you count old Gerwin, who shouts most things. But that's more of a personal problem than a marketing strategy. Word of the festival spreads like wildfire through whispers exchanged over well buckets, muttered under breath during church sermons, and shouted across fields by enthusiastic children who may or may not be accurate in their retelling. The festival wasn't exclusive. If you were breathing and within a reasonable walking distance, and sometimes even if you weren't, you came. Part of it was the promise of rare goods, imported spices, strange fabrics, shiny trinkets that your practical brain knew were useless, but your heart desperately wanted. The other part? The chance to escape routine, flirt recklessly, and eat something besides stewed turnips for once. Preparations started weeks prior, with villagers bustling about like agitated geese. Stalls were cobbled together from mismatched planks and wagon wheels that looked one stiff breeze away from collapse. Flags made of faded fabrics, and the occasional pair of someone's retired undergarments flapped proudly along the muddy thoroughfare. Everyone contributed what they could. Some baked bread, others brewed ale, and those particularly brave attempted to craft artisan goods, a term used generously to describe everything from misshapen clay mugs to embroidered tunics that looked suspiciously like they were made by drunk squirrels. Fashion at the festival was less about elegance and more about survival. You wore your best clothes, which usually meant the least stained and slightly patched. Wool cloaks were common, earthy tones dominated, and anyone flaunting vibrant colors was either wealthier than they looked or had recently traded with a merchant bold enough to cross the northern marshes. Shoes were optional but recommended, unless you enjoyed the sensation of stepping on sharp pebbles or questionable animal droppings. Vendors arrived from far and wide, their carts groaning under the weight of goods ranging from genuinely exotic to hilariously mundane. You might find a silk scarf from distant shores displayed beside a suspiciously dented frying pan, or a jar of healing ointment that looked and smelled like mashed weeds. Prices were negotiable, but only if you possessed sharp wits or an even sharper tongue. Otherwise, you risked trading your best chicken for a bag of rocks artfully labeled as decorative minerals. The market wasn't just about commerce. It was a stage, a performance ground for entertainers of every questionable skill level. Jugglers balanced flaming torches with alarming nonchalance. Jesters tumbled through the mud, and traveling musicians played lutes, fiddles, and pipes with varying degrees of talent. Some could charm a tune from their instrument that made even the grumpiest elder tap their foot. Others made noises so bewildering that livestock fled and small children cried. Speaking of children, they swarmed the festival like hyperactive squirrels unleashed upon a field of unattended snacks. Parents, distracted by haggling or ale, barely noticed as toddlers toddled dangerously close to fire pits or goats. Older kids formed unruly gangs, daring each other to steal apples, pester merchants, or ride the village pig, famously known as Buttercup, whose temperament was as sour as spoiled milk. Buttercup had unseated more riders than most noble knights ever managed in tournaments, and her reputation was feared and respected. Now, no festival was complete without the annual Test of Strength and Wit, an ambitious name for a contest that mostly involved villagers humiliating themselves in public. It combined feats like log tossing, barrel rolling, and the infamous trivia challenge, where participants attempted to answer obscure historical questions shouted by the town's self-declared scholar, Henrik. Henrik's credentials were murky at best, consisting mostly of having once seen a book and owning 3 whole teeth. But no one dared question his authority, especially when he'd downed his celebratory ale. The day flowed in waves of noise, laughter, and minor injuries. Old friends reunited, trading exaggerated tales of the year's hardships, crop failures, livestock escapes. The time lightning struck the church's weather vane and sparked theological debate about divine messaging through poorly aimed lightning bolts. Gossip swirled thicker than the smoke from cooking fires, dissecting who had gotten engaged, who had fallen dramatically off their roof, and whose child had mysteriously developed an accent after spending 2 weeks with visiting merchants. Of course, with ale flowing freely, the festival's tone shifted as the sun dipped low. Negotiations turned louder, dance circles formed spontaneously, and declarations of love, or inebriated friendship, rang out across the village square. Young couples, emboldened by fermented courage, exchanged glances, shy smiles, and awkwardly handed over trinkets, while elders shook their heads and muttered about how things were different in their day. They weren't, but tradition demands selective memory. As twilight settled, the bonfire was lit. An enormous, crackling pyre that illuminated flushed faces, sparkling eyes, and a chaotic swirl of smoke, laughter, and off-key singing. Musicians, now deep into their cups, played faster, stumbling over chords with reckless glee. Dancers stamped mud into the ground, spinning wildly, limbs flailing in joyful abandon. It wasn't graceful, but it was sincere, the raw, chaotic celebration of people who spent most of their lives surviving, now given a fleeting moment to simply live. But no festival escaped chaos entirely. Arguments flared, accidental slap fights broke out. Someone inevitably flirted with the wrong person, and there was at least one mysterious goat theft before midnight. By then, most revelers were either passed out beside the fire, swaying to the fading music, or stumbling home with muddy boots, a suspiciously acquired chicken, and enough stories to last until next year's gathering. And through it all, the heart of the festival pulsed, a community bound not by perfection, but by the shared, beautiful mess of life. As the embers of the bonfire smoldered beneath a sky littered with silver stars, Elderbrook's festival refused to sleep. The heart of the celebration beat strongest at night, pulsing through lantern-lit alleys and muddy footpaths where clusters of villagers gathered, mugs in hand, retelling stories that had already been stretched into legends by the third retelling. The air carried the mingled scents of roasted meat, burnt bread, and wood smoke, undercut by the ever-present, faintly tragic aroma of livestock that had been dressed in garlands and promptly regretted every decision leading to that point. You couldn't walk more than 10 paces without stumbling across another pocket of chaos. In one corner, a group of blacksmith apprentices attempted to lift a cartwheel as proof of their strength, their faces red, their arms trembling, and their dignity slowly evaporating as the wheel refused to budge. Near the baker's stall, a highly competitive pie-eating contest unfolded, with participants smeared in berry juice, crumbs stuck to their cheeks, and their pride hanging precariously by a thread. The village healer, an older woman named Mirabelle, hovered nearby with a jug of questionable herbs, prepared to intervene if anyone choked, fainted, or spontaneously confessed undying love to a blueberry tart. Music never truly stopped. It merely mutated as the evening deepened. A young man with wild curls and a battered mandolin strummed furiously near the well, accompanied by an enthusiastic drummer who banged rhythmically on 2 overturned barrels. Their tune was fast, rough, and likely composed on the spot. but it had villagers stomping their feet, clapping in time and forgetting that their boots were now permanently caked in mud. Children, now high on crusts of bread and sneaky sips of weak ale, darted through the crowd like mischievous shadows. They weaved between legs, hurled harmless insults at one another, and launched an ongoing competition to see who could acquire the most outrageous festival prize. One girl paraded around with a stuffed toy fox sewn from leftover fabric scraps, while a boy proudly displayed a wooden spoon he claimed was enchanted. It wasn't, but his confidence earned him admirers nonetheless. Underneath the festive clamor, the traders continued their business with steely focus. You could spot the seasoned merchants by their well-practiced grins and eyes sharp enough to spot a loose coin from across the square. Their stalls glittered with trinkets, polished stones promising good fortune, vials of colored liquid allegedly capable of curing headaches, heartbreak, and possibly chicken pox, and small wooden carvings depicting everything from animals to mythical beasts, each priced as if it were carved by divine hands themselves. Locals haggled fiercely, some scoring bargains, others walking away cursing their lack of bartering prowess. There were whispers of a traveling trader named Emmerich, known for his outrageous tales of distant lands filled with deserts that stretched forever and cities carved into cliffs. His wares were as mysterious as his origins: spices sharp enough to make your eyes water, fabrics that shimmered under firelight, and glass beads that caught the moonlight like stars trapped in crystal. Skeptics muttered that half his goods were crafted in the next village over, but no one could resist the allure of owning something with a story attached, even if the story was as crooked as a politician's promise. Throughout the evening, flirtations blossomed like stubborn weeds after rain. Young men and women exchanged glances across crowded spaces, tentative smiles slipping between them like secret codes. The bravest approached with offerings: a clumsily braided bracelet, a wilted flower plucked from the festival's makeshift decorations, or in one memorable case, half a roasted turnip still steaming from the fire. Romance wasn't defined by grand gestures. It was about moments snatched between music, laughter, and the ever-present risk of stepping in something unpleasant. Of course, not all exchanges went smoothly. An unfortunate lad named Tomlin attempted to serenade the innkeeper's daughter with a borrowed lute and a voice that cracked worse than old pottery. His song, somewhere between poetry and accident, drew laughter, affectionate teasing, and eventually, a light-hearted scolding from the innkeeper himself, who declared that if Tomlin truly wanted to win his daughter's favor, he'd better learn to hold a note longer than a frightened chicken. Meanwhile, the elders observed from wooden benches dragged into prime viewing spots near the fire. They sipped lukewarm ale, shared tales embroidered with exaggeration, and issued running commentaries on the proceedings with the authority of those who had seen it all and survived. They judged the dancers, appraised the goods, and critiqued the entertainers with the same energy others reserved for royal court debates. In my day, one elderly man declared, squinting toward the dancers, we knew how to keep rhythm. None of this wild flailing. You call that dancing? Looks more like dodging angry geese. His companion nodded sagely, adding, aye, but at least they've still got their teeth. That's worth celebrating. The livestock, unaware of their unintentional participation in the festivities, milled about in varying states of confusion and resignation. Sheep adorned with flower garlands bleated mournfully near the cider stalls. Pigs lounged contentedly in mud patches that doubled as dance floors, and chickens darted through the crowd with the precision of veteran escape artists. One particularly bold goat, dubbed Captain Buttons by the children, staged an impromptu coup near the bread vendor, snatching a loaf and parading his victory across the square, much to the delight of spectators. The festival's heart lay not in its grandeur, but in its joyful imperfection. The mismatched decorations, the uneven music, the clumsy dancers, the eccentric traders spinning tall tales thicker than the fog that rolled in after midnight. It was in the moments where strangers shared food, old friends reunited with exaggerated hugs, and even the shyest villagers found themselves swept into laughter, music, and the warm glow of firelight. As the night deepened and the stars blazed brighter, the villagers of Elderbrook knew they would return to their routines come morning: the fields, the livestock, the endless chores that defined their lives. But for this one, fleeting evening, They belonged to something greater than toil. They belonged to the festival, the stories, the music, and the muddy, chaotic beauty of shared celebration. As the hours slipped by and the moon hung heavy above Elderbrook, the festival refused to lose momentum. It only twisted into new, more unruly shapes. Near the edge of the village square, beyond the flickering reach of the bonfire, the famed, and often feared, challenge circle was formed. This was no grand arena, just a clearing flattened by countless boots, framed by curious spectators eager to see bravery, foolishness, or ideally, both in spectacular fashion. Here, under the approving gaze of a drunken crowd, villagers tested their mettle in competitions ranging from mildly impressive to wildly unwise. First came the sack races, where grown adults stuffed themselves into burlap bags meant for storing grain and flailed toward the finish line like deranged kangaroos, tumbling into each other with alarming frequency. There were roars of laughter as faces planted firmly into the mud, but pride was stubborn, and so they bounced, rolled, and stumbled forward, determined to earn the flimsy ribbon of victory and the even flimsier bragging rights that followed. Then arrived the arm wrestling bouts where calloused hands gripped worn tables and the spectators leaned in close, breaths held, wagers exchanged in whispers. Farmers with forearms like tree trunks squared off against weavers with deceptive strength, their faces contorted with effort as the crowd howled in delight. No one escaped unscathed, pride bruised, egos battered, and arms sore for days. But glory was fleeting, and soon the challenge shifted again. One of the most anticipated yet absurd contests was the infamous greased pole climb. A towering wooden post, slick with lard, loomed near the blacksmith's forge. At the top, prizes dangled. A pouch of copper coins, a wheel of cheese, and a suspiciously wobbly bottle labeled "Fortune in a Flask," though no one could confirm its contents or safety. Brave or foolish, participants attempted the climb, slipping and sliding, their efforts met with roaring applause and relentless teasing. The few who reached the summit were celebrated as heroes, showered in mud, glory, and unsolicited marriage proposals. Nearby, under a canopy of patchwork cloth, the fortune-teller's tent whispered promises of mystery and intrigue. Its owner, a sharp-eyed woman named Isara, spoke with an accent from distant southern coasts and wore layers of flowing fabric embroidered with symbols no one could quite decipher. Villagers lined up, eager to hear their futures, their fates revealed through worn cards, lines etched into their palms, or the ominous swirl of leaves floating in chipped ceramic bowls. Some left grinning with promises of prosperity. Others departed pale, clutching talismans to ward off vague but terrifying doom. Skeptics scoffed, but even they couldn't resist peeking through the tent's flaps, curiosity outweighing doubt. At the festival's heart, the dancing refused to wane. Circles of stomping feet formed around the ever-burning bonfire, growing looser, wilder, and far less coordinated as ale flowed freely. Boots were discarded, tunics untucked, and inhibitions thrown aside with reckless joy. The music evolved. String instruments screeched in uneven harmony, drums beat in erratic pulses, and voices tangled in drunken songs that dissolved into fits of laughter. Elders clapped along, some brave enough to shuffle through the steps, others content to observe and critique with loving exasperation. Children, sticky with berry juice and dirt, twirled at the edges, mimicking their elders with wide-eyed determination, their small bodies collapsing into giggles when dizzy legs failed them. Merchants, never ones to waste opportunity, thrived under moonlight. Their stalls transformed into bustling hubs of midnight commerce, illuminated by lanterns swinging from wooden beams or perched on precarious tabletops. Trinkets exchanged hands at alarming rates. Faded scarves woven with questionable magic, miniature figurines carved from bone, glass bottles of colored sand, claiming to capture the essence of far-off deserts. Coins clinked, but so did trade in goods. A plump hen swapped for a bolt of fabric, a basket of eggs for a pewter necklace, promises of future favors scribbled hastily onto scraps of parchment when neither party possessed immediate currency. Laughter rang out near the cider barrel, where the villagers' tolerance or lack thereof was on full display. Faces flushed, eyes sparkled, and inhibitions crumbled beneath the warm haze of strong drink. Confessions tumbled free with alarming ease. Secret crushes revealed. Minor rivalries reignited. Forgotten debts suddenly remembered and forgiven under the influence of fermented camaraderie. The brewer, a stout man with a beard that could nest a family of birds, dispensed his potent cider with theatrical flourish, boasting of secret recipes passed down through generations, though most suspected his secret was simply more apples and fewer safety standards. Amidst the chaos, the elders continued their slow orbit of observation, seated on worn benches and overturned barrels, their sharp eyes missing little. They reminisced with exaggerated flair, recounting festivals past where the music was sweeter, the ale stronger, and the dancers slightly less prone to tripping over livestock. Their words drifted into the crisp night air, mingling with the crackle of the bonfire and the faint melodies carried by the wind. Overhead, the stars wheeled silently across the sky, indifferent to the human revelry below, yet providing the perfect canopy for a night carved out of routine and stitched together with joy, mischief, and the timeless hunger for connection. As the festival of Elderbrook reached its chaotic crescendo, there emerged one undeniable truth. No matter how much ale flowed, how wildly feet stomped in the mud, or how many goats attempted an unsanctioned escape, the true soul of the gathering pulsed through its stories. The festival was not merely a place to barter trinkets or fumble through dance steps. It was a living archive of shared histories, embellished tales, and the kind of exaggerated legends that blurred seamlessly into reality when retold by firelight after enough cider. It was near the embers of the bonfire that the most experienced storytellers held court. Some were weathered farmers with sun-leathered faces. Others were traveling minstrels whose entire livelihood depended on weaving words into gold. They gathered the crowd, young and old, into huddled clusters where the smoke curled upward like the prelude to a myth, and began spinning yarns with practiced ease. One tale spoke of the great blizzard of 40 winters past, where snow buried the fields so deep that villagers tunneled between houses, navigating by memory and the faint glow of lanterns. According to the storyteller, a heroic pig named Alder saved the village by unearthing the grain stores with nothing but stubborn determination and an impressive snout. No one truly believed the pig's involvement, but no one dared correct the story either. It had grown too beloved, too rooted in their cultural tapestry to be questioned now. Another story wove the history of a wandering spirit, a trickster ghost named Fenric who was said to haunt the outskirts of Elderbrook, stealing left boots, tangling fishing nets, and whispering nonsense into the ears of half-asleep villagers. Some swore they heard his mischievous laughter in the rustling reeds by the creek, though skeptics blamed it on the wind, or perhaps the brewer's particularly strong cider. Yet on festival night, even the skeptics leaned in closer, eyes wide, as the tale unfolded under the moonlit sky. Between stories, laughter erupted as impromptu contests sprouted from the crowd. Young men challenged each other to balance precariously atop wooden fences, only to tumble gracelessly into hay piles, limbs flailing, pride dented. Children dared one another to pluck apples from the highest branches of the orchard's gnarled trees, their small hands scrabbling for purchase while elders shouted half-hearted warnings from below. Even the village's animals found themselves unwilling participants in the games. A duck, now infamously known as Sir Quacksalot, was dressed in a makeshift knight's helmet fashioned from tin, waddling indignantly through the crowd as villagers toasted to his bravery. By now, the ground beneath their feet was churned into a patchwork of mud, straw, and discarded ribbons, a testament to the hours of dancing, stumbling, and unrestrained revelry. Torches flickered along the main road, casting elongated shadows that danced and wavered against the walls of thatched cottages and vendor stalls. Smoke spiraled lazily from cooking fires, mingling with the faint aroma of roasting meat and the sharper scent of herbal remedies sold by eager merchants touting their wares as cures for everything from sore backs to lovesickness. Near the edge of the festival grounds, a quieter circle had formed, a gathering of those who carried instruments of delicate craftsmanship, fiddles carved from aged wood, pipes etched with swirling patterns, harps small enough to cradle in one's lap. These were the musicians who thrived in the softer hours of the festival, their melodies drifting gently over the weary crowd like silk on the wind. Couples swayed together, their movement slower now, more tender as the earlier chaos settled into a contented hum of shared warmth. Nearby, elders hummed along to forgotten songs, their voices raspy but filled with memory, while wide-eyed children curled against their parents, heavy with sleep and the remnants of sticky treats. And still, the merchants remained, ever watchful, ever ready. They lit small lanterns atop their carts, casting a warm glow over polished trinkets, faded maps marked with cryptic symbols, and spice pouches that promised to ignite even the dullest stew with exotic flavor. Deals were struck with whispers and firm handshakes, goods exchanged with practiced precision honed by years of bartering on festival nights like this. Even the most skeptical villagers found themselves drawn in, palms itching for the weight of some small treasure to mark the occasion. Amidst it all, the quiet connections bloomed, the unspoken understandings forged in laughter shared over missteps, in clasped hands during the softer songs, in knowing glances exchanged as the stars wheeled overhead, ancient and indifferent to their fleeting joys. It was these moments that lingered long after the festival fires burned low, after the last note of music faded into memory. The festival wasn't merely an escape from daily toil, it was the stitching of community, messy and imperfect, but strong enough to weather seasons of hardship, laughter, and relentless gossip about heroic pigs and mischievous ghosts. As the night stretched its arms across the village and the distant hills dissolved into shadow, Elderbrook's festival took on an unmistakable haze, the kind that only arrives when fatigue, ale, and the stubborn refusal to let the night end collide in glorious disorder. The bonfire, now reduced to glowing embers, still crackled softly, casting halos of orange light across faces flushed with drink and merriment. Around the dwindling flames, conversation slowed into a comfortable murmur, punctuated by the occasional burst of laughter or the off-key chorus of yet another drinking song, butchered beyond recognition, but sung with unwavering enthusiasm. The ground, once bustling with frenzied dancing, had softened into pockets of scattered groups huddled beneath wool cloaks, sharing the last scraps of food, swapping stories, and staring upwards at the dark velvet sky embroidered with flickering stars. At the heart of the village square, the remnants of the merchants' stalls stood like weary sentinels, fabrics fluttering weakly in the cool breeze, empty baskets tipped on their sides, and forgotten trinkets glinting faintly in the torchlight. Some traders had packed their wares and slipped away into the night, their carts creaking softly along the dirt roads leading toward distant markets and unknown towns. Others remained, their goods diminished but their eyes sharp, ever ready for a final sale to an impulsive villager fueled by the courage only fermented cider could provide. Near the cider barrels, a group of young men engaged in a spirited debate over the festival's most pressing matter: who precisely had managed the most spectacular fall during the greased pole climb. Accusations flew, arms gestured wildly, and exaggerated reenactments unfolded, with onlookers jeering, cheering, and occasionally correcting the retellings with their own, equally biased versions of events. Elsewhere, in the quieter corners of the festival grounds, the elders remained perched on their makeshift thrones of overturned barrels and wobbly benches, their eyes heavy-lidded but still glinting with the sharpness honed by decades of similar nights. They exchanged low murmurs, the topics meandering between commentary on the youth's poor dance posture, subtle matchmaking efforts, and thinly veiled boasts of their own long-past festival conquests. One elderly woman, her silver hair braided neatly down her back, recounted the tale of when, in her younger days, she had bested 3 men in a foot race across the village square while balancing a basket of apples on her head. The accuracy of this tale was debated, but the conviction in her voice brooked no challenge, and so the story settled comfortably into the festival's growing library of lore. The livestock, once the unwitting stars of the festivities, now dozed in muddy pens or wandered lazily along the edges of the village. The infamous goat, Captain Buttons, lounged near a food stall, his ill-gotten loaf of bread long devoured, his eyes half-closed in smug satisfaction. Chickens nestled in hay bales, sheep huddled together, their floral garlands askew, their bleating softened into gentle hums against the backdrop of distant music. Children, having burned through their reserves of wild energy, lay sprawled across their parents' laps or bundled into hay piles, their cheeks smudged with dirt, their fingers sticky with the remnants of stolen treats, their dreams no doubt filled with exaggerated versions of the night's chaos, dancing goats, enchanted spoons, and heroes clad in makeshift armor. Even as the festival ebbed toward its inevitable conclusion, small pockets of activity refused to surrender. A lone fiddler played by the well, his tune slow, sweet, and haunting in the early hours, drawing a scattering of villagers to sway gently, their feet tracing worn patterns in the trampled grass. Couples lingered in the shadows of half-lit alleys, exchanging whispered promises and clumsy kisses, their laughter mingling with the music. Their futures uncertain, but, for tonight, wrapped in the intoxicating glow of shared joy. It was during these twilight hours, when the village teetered between celebration and exhaustion, that the final, unofficial tradition of Elderbrook's festival unfolded. The wandering philosopher. His name was Bram, though most knew him simply as the Rambler, for his fondness of weaving elaborate, borderline nonsensical reflections once the ale loosened his tongue. Cloaked in tattered robes, a crooked walking stick in hand, Bram drifted through the crowd, delivering unsolicited wisdom to anyone within earshot. "The stars," he declared to a cluster of bleary-eyed youths near the fire, "are not merely balls of fire, no. They are the watching eyes of ancestors, judging your dancing and your life choices. Dance better, or suffer their cosmic disapproval." His audience giggled, some with amusement, others with the foggy confusion of those several cups deep into cider. But Bram pressed on, cornering a pair of traders, finalizing a quiet deal, informing them with great conviction that currency is but a distraction. True wealth is measured in stories, laughter, and how many chickens survive your neighbor's cooking. And so the Rambler wandered, his philosophical ramblings trailing behind him like smoke, half forgotten but fondly regarded, woven into the festival as naturally as song, drink, and the endless reappearance of misplaced livestock. The village of Elderbrook, though softened by the weariness creeping into every limb, still pulsed with the stubborn spirit that refused to let the festival fade into silence. Somewhere near the edge of the square, under the tattered awning of a merchant's cart now half empty of wares, two figures squared off in an impromptu competition that would be discussed in whispers for weeks to come, a cheese wheel rolling race. It was simple in design, ridiculous in execution. Select your finest or least structurally sound round of cheese, release it down the uneven slope near the carpenter's workshop, and pray it reached the finish line without shattering into a dairy disaster. The contestants, a burly farmhand named Alric and a wiry shepherd known as Ewan, stood poised at the top of the hill, their chosen wheels cradled like precious relics. Spectators lined the slope, their cheers muffled only by hands stuffed with bread or mugs of frothy ale. The countdown was called, the wheels released, and down they tumbled, bouncing, wobbling, and veering dangerously toward onlookers who scattered with delighted shrieks as the cheese careened in unpredictable, chaotic arcs. Alric's wheel met an early tragic end, splintering into fragments against a rock, while Ewan's miraculously survived, though by the finish line, more resembled an abstract sculpture than food. No one cared for the outcome's technicalities. The cheering was thunderous, the laughter loud enough to wake the drowsy goats. And somewhere, a philosophical argument sparked regarding whether fragmented cheese still counted as victory. Beyond the slope, in the festival's quieter nooks, subtle plots thickened like stew over a slow flame. Two neighboring families, locked in a long-standing dispute over boundary lines, exchanged passive-aggressive gifts of slightly misshapen loaves of bread, each smiling with all the warmth of winter frost while muttering oaths under their breath. A traveling merchant discreetly peddled charms promising luck in love, their origins dubious but their appeal undeniable, especially to wide-eyed youths emboldened by festival magic and ale-induced confidence. Elders, ever the sentinels of village memory, exchanged theories on who among the young couples would marry next, who had danced too closely, and which quiet flirtations would bloom into scandalous headlines whispered over fences and market stalls in the weeks to follow. Children, long past the bounds of reasonable bedtime, roamed the festival grounds in ragtag packs, fueled by sugar, mischief, and the boundless energy that only the young possess when supervision has utterly collapsed. They staged mock battles with sticks, adorned themselves in garlands stolen from livestock, and dared each other to sneak sips of neglected ale mugs left abandoned near the storyteller's circle. One particularly ambitious boy, brandishing a wooden sword carved hastily from firewood, declared himself protector of Elderbrook, before promptly tripping over a chicken and dissolving into giggles as his self-appointed guard collapsed around him in similarly undignified fashion. And still through it all, the music wove its persistent spell across the square. Musicians, though their fingers ached and their voices cracked, played on, fueled by communal spirit, fleeting glory, and the occasional bribe of roasted meat or strong drink. The tunes ranged from boisterous drinking anthems that rattled window shutters to haunting ballads of forgotten heroes and doomed love, their lyrics embroidered with exaggerated feats and tragedies that had likely never occurred, but resonated all the same. Dancers, muddy, disheveled, and delightfully shameless, continued their stomping, spinning, and leaping, limbs entangled, faces flushed, their movements a chaotic blend of tradition, improvisation, and the unavoidable influence of too much cider. Merchants whose stalls had dwindled to mere scraps of inventory resorted to bartering favors and tales, exchanging ghost stories for loaves of bread, or riddles for the last scraps of woven cloth. The atmosphere crackled with weary joy, the kind that hummed beneath heavy eyelids and aching feet, a stubborn refusal to surrender to sleep when the night still held stories yet untold, connections yet forged, and laughter lingering like embers glowing softly beneath ash. Above it all, the stars glittered, silent, ancient witnesses to the festival's fleeting blaze, their cold brilliance a sharp contrast to the earthy, boisterous warmth of Elderbrook's celebration. A reminder that while the world beyond stretched vast and unknown, here in the village life was measured in music, missteps, and the sticky fingers of children still chasing adventure long after midnight. As the village square slumped into the deeper folds of the night, the festival of Elderbrook took on a quieter, more peculiar rhythm, the kind that emerges only when the exhausted and the truly determined remain behind. The air hung heavy with the mingled scents of spent torches, trampled grass, burnt bread crusts, and that faint, unmistakable aroma of livestock reminding everyone that no celebration, however grand, ever quite escaped the earthy fingerprints of rural life. Those few fires still burning crackled lazily, casting pale light across the worn faces of villagers nestled in small groups, nursing the dregs of their mugs. Their conversations slowed into a soft hum, punctuated by yawns and half-finished anecdotes. Yet among the weariness, fragments of activity pulsed stubbornly. In one shadowed corner, tucked between the leaning frame of the weaver's hut and a tilted produce cart, a gathering of the boldest youths embarked on the final rite of the festival, the lantern dare. It was an unspoken tradition, whispered to each generation with growing layers of exaggerated peril, wherein participants carried flickering lanterns beyond the village borders, down the winding woodland paths to the ancient stone circle, half swallowed by moss and ivy. The older villagers spoke of that place with cautious reverence, weaving stories of spirits lingering among the stones, of whispers carried on the breeze, and the faint glow of otherworldly lights flickering where no torch should burn. Truth tangled with superstition, but the dare persisted, tempting those fueled by youthful bravado, festival adrenaline, and questionable amounts of cider to tempt fate beneath the cold gaze of the stars. The group set off with laughter too loud for their nerves, their lanterns swaying in uneven rhythm, their boots crunching along the worn footpath that carved its way through tangled undergrowth and leaning oaks. Behind them, Elderbrook's festival drifted into muted echoes, the distant strum of a lute, the faint cheer of a final toast, the cluck of a disgruntled chicken protesting its festival ordeal. The forest embraced them, its branches twisting overhead like skeletal fingers, its floor blanketed in fallen leaves that whispered underfoot. Even the boldest among them fell quiet as the ancient stones emerged from the gloom, their weathered faces mottled with lichen, their surfaces etched with carvings too faded to decipher, but brimming with the weight of forgotten generations. They circled the stones, the amber glow of their lanterns pooling weakly against the shadows, nerves prickling beneath bravado as they recited fragments of stories passed down like heirlooms, of the traveler who vanished upon crossing the stones, of the spectral figure glimpsed beneath the harvest moon, of the way the forest held its breath within this ring of ancient rock. But nothing stirred beyond the rustle of the wind and the faint creak of shifting trees. They lingered long enough to prove their courage, exchanging nervous grins and whispered jests, before retreating to the safety of the festival. Their return met with mock applause from those elders still awake, who remembered their own youthful forays and the lingering thrill of conquering superstition, however briefly. Back in the heart of the square, the last vestiges of the festival folded into themselves like an exhausted campfire reduced to warm embers. Vendors packed away what few goods remained, their carts lighter, their coin purses heavier, their voices rough from hours of hawking and storytelling. Musicians, fingers raw and voices hoarse, strummed the final frayed notes of songs born in joy and fermented spirits, their melodies wandering into the dark like fading echoes of the night's wild crescendo. Couples curled beneath wool blankets, sharing whispered promises that would dissolve with the morning sun or, in rare cases, root themselves into the soil of shared futures. Children slumped against hay bales, their faces smudged, their dreams tangled with fragments of music, laughter, and the chaotic imagery only a festival could etch upon young minds. Above, the stars remained sharp and cold, distant pinpricks of ancient light staring down with quiet indifference, their brilliance undimmed by the flickering fires and human revelry far below. And yet, in the small, worn square of Elderbrook, where dirt roads twisted between thatched cottages and stone chimneys exhaled thin ribbons of smoke, those stars bore witness to something fragile and persistent: the ache for celebration, the clumsy weaving of community, the joyful, stumbling rebellion against the monotony of survival. The festival was not perfect. It never had been. The stew was oversalted, the ale questionably brewed, the music rarely in tune, and the dance steps more hazard than performance. Yet beneath its imperfections bloomed something real: connection, humor, and the understanding that in these fleeting hours, amid the cracked cobblestones, drunken ballads, and bewildered livestock, the people of Elderbrook carved a sanctuary from the grind of fields and winter, if only for a night. As the first whispers of dawn bled into the edges of the night, Elderbrook's festival lingered in its final stubborn phase, the slow unraveling where sleep-deprived villagers clung to the last embers of celebration, unwilling to surrender to the weight of routine creeping back into their bones. The sky shifted from deep velvet to a muted, bruised gray, the faintest slivers of pale light slicing across the distant hills, illuminating the muddy footprints, discarded ribbons, and half-toppled barrels that littered the square like artifacts from a battle between merriment and exhaustion. The bonfire, once a roaring beacon, had quieted into a low, glowing heap of coals that pulsed faint warmth toward those huddled nearby, their faces slack with fatigue but their eyes still glinting with the stubborn pride of having outlasted the revelry. The last of the cider sloshed weakly at the bottom of wooden mugs, and bread crusts, now hard as stone, were gnawed on by the truly desperate, their jaws working through the effort with more determination than hunger. Across the square, merchants dismantled their makeshift stalls, their goods packed into weathered carts, their coin pouches heavy with the night's earnings, their laughter brittle but satisfied. Traders exchanged exaggerated farewells, each departure laced with boasts of future adventures, unconfirmed plans to return next season, and the usual barrage of wild tales about distant cities, impossible landscapes, and encounters with creatures that likely never existed, but made for excellent conversation. In one corner, a pair of young villagers leaned heavily against the frame of an empty cart, their heads lolling in half-sleep, fingers loosely entwined, their whispered words slurred by fatigue and the lingering haze of drink. It was a familiar scene, echoed countless times through generations, the tentative beginning of stories that might blossom into marriages or drift away like smoke by morning. Yet for this fragile pocket of time, bound by festival magic and the soft hush of approaching dawn, everything felt suspended in possibility. Children, finally defeated by their own chaotic energy, sprawled across hay piles, their limbs tangled, their faces smudged with dirt and crumbs, dreams thick with remnants of games, laughter, and fleeting glimpses of firelit wonder. A few dogs snored nearby, their bellies full from stolen scraps, their fur dusted with straw and confetti-like flower petals, scattered haphazardly across the trampled ground. Even the notorious Captain Buttons, Elderbrook's most troublesome goat, stood motionless near the cider barrels, his eyes half-lidded, his usual rebellious spark dulled by the hours of unintentional fame, stolen bread, and relentless head-pats from overzealous children. Only the faintest sounds of music lingered now, a lone flute warbling a sleepy tune near the well, its notes swaying like the final breaths of a fading dream, blending with the coo of drowsy pigeons perched along rooftops, and the distant rustle of morning wind weaving through the tangled banners still hanging limp across the square. And yet, beneath the weariness, the villagers carried an undeniable spark, a quiet triumph that hummed through sore feet and aching backs, woven into the collective memory of shared laughter, botched dances, and stories that would only grow more elaborate with retelling. The festival, for all its muddy chaos and drunken missteps, was more than a night of distraction. It was the tether holding them together, stitching their lives across seasons of hard labor, harsh winters, and the daily grind of survival with threads of joy, absurdity, and relentless community spirit. It was the whispered promise that amidst the dirt roads and weathered cottages, amidst the mundane routine of tending fields and mending roofs, there would always be room for music, for mischief, for nights when even the most practical souls let their feet stomp mud and their hearts believe in the ridiculous beauty of celebration. And so as the faint light of morning crept steadily across Elderbrook's rooftops, painting the square in muted gold, the festival yielded at last to the slow unraveling of dawn, its echoes etched into every footprint, every half-sung melody, every lingering thread of smoke curling toward the awakening sky. As the first rays of sunlight crept cautiously over the rolling hills beyond Elderbrook, the remnants of the festival melted into the gentle hum of morning routine. The village square, now littered with flattened patches of grass, forgotten scarves, and bits of charred wood from the fire, resembled the aftermath of a storm of music, laughter, and questionable life choices. Villagers stirred slowly from their impromptu beds made of hay bales, cloaks, or the occasional overturned barrel. The bravest among them blinked blearily toward the horizon where the faint glow of dawn stretched its fingers across the mist-laced rooftops, and with groggy resignation, began the slow process of disentangling themselves from the stubborn grip of exhaustion. A few merchants, their carts packed tight and their faces drawn with fatigue, clattered quietly along the dirt roads leading out of town, the sound of wagon wheels mixing with the muted coos of doves perched along the eaves. Their departure was marked not by grand farewells, but with knowing nods, half-formed smiles, and the silent promise that they would return next year, their tales taller, their goods slightly more overpriced, and their love for the village's eccentricities intact. Those villagers still milling about picked through the debris of the square, retrieving wayward shoes, abandoned shawls, and, in one memorable case, a sleeping chicken tucked neatly beneath a pile of ribbons as though it had crowned itself festival royalty. Children roused reluctantly from their dreams, rubbed their eyes with dirt-smudged fists, their small faces still aglow with the aftershocks of adventure. Some recounted their nighttime escapades with wild hand gestures and exaggerated sound effects, boasting of heroic stick duels, daring dashes through the crowd, and encounters with mysterious shadowy figures who, upon closer inspection, turned out to be disgruntled sheep seeking shelter from the chaos. The elders, their bodies creaking as much as the worn benches beneath them, exchanged conspiratorial glances, their conversations now shifting toward practicalities, the state of the square, the livestock that had wandered off during the festivities, and the inevitable cleanup that awaited once the last song faded from memory. Amidst the haze of dawn, the infamous goat Captain Buttons made his final festival rounds, strutting boldly through the lingering crowd, his floral garlands askew, but his expression victorious, as though the entire night's revelry had been orchestrated purely for his amusement. Children trailed behind him, their laughter drifting like smoke on the cool morning breeze, their pockets filled with pebbles, crumbs, and the odd trinkets scavenged from the fading celebration. Near the edge of the square, the storytellers, those perennial guardians of Elderbrook's folklore, huddled together, their voices low as they debated which fragments of the night's chaos would be immortalized in the village's ever-growing archive of exaggerated tales. The Great Cheese Wheel disaster, the Lantern Dare, and of course the heroic speeches of Bram the Rambler would all find their place, embellished with each retelling until truth and fiction danced together as naturally as the festival itself. The bonfire, now reduced to soft ash and glowing coals, stood as the last sentinel of the celebration's fiery heart. Couples lingered beside it, their fingers intertwined, their words quiet and uncertain beneath the lingering intoxication of the night's temporary magic. Whether they would walk together beneath the sun as they had beneath the stars was a question for another day. But for now they basked in the fragile aftermath of connection, their footprints etched into the mud, their hearts heavy with the realization that soon the routine would reclaim them. But even as the villagers drifted away, back toward cottages, fields, and the quiet rituals of daily life, the spirit of the festival clung to Elderbrook like morning mist over the fields, a reminder that joy, no matter how fleeting, could carve itself into the bones of the mundane, leaving behind stories, laughter, and the stubborn promise that it would all return again when the seasons turned and the banners were raised once more. As the full glow of morning settled over Elderbrook, painting the rooftops gold and stirring the distant fields into soft waves of green and amber, the final traces of the festival disappeared beneath the creeping return of routine. The once vibrant square, echoing with music, laughter, and the chaotic rhythm of countless feet, now lay quiet, but for the cause of opportunistic crows circling overhead, and the occasional creak of wooden carts returning borrowed benches to their rightful places. Villagers, their faces weary but content, swept away ribbons tangled in fence posts, collected the last of the cider barrels, and mended the stalls that had weathered the night's festivities with the fragile grace of structures held together more by hope than craftsmanship. Despite the exhaustion draped across every shoulder, despite the mud-caked boots and the stiff backs, there lingered beneath the fatigue a quiet satisfaction, the kind that only settled in after surviving the storm of joy, chaos, and unrestrained celebration that was the Elderbrook Festival. Old Mirabelle, the village healer, shuffled along the square with her basket of dried herbs, muttering beneath her breath as she examined bruises, twisted ankles, and one unfortunate lad who had attempted to balance atop the cider barrel and paid dearly for his hubris. Yet even her scolding carried a note of amusement, her weathered eyes glinting as she tied makeshift bandages and handed out foul-tasting remedies guaranteed to sober the most determined reveler. The elders, now retreating to their cottages or favored benches near the chapel, exchanged final commentary on the night's events, their critiques softened by nostalgia, their laughter crinkling the corners of their eyes. Every misstep, every fumbled dance, every exaggerated story weaving its way into the village's collective memory. None would be forgotten. At the edge of the square, a group of young villagers lingered, their heads tilted toward the field stretching beyond the village, their voices hushed as they plotted, dreamed, and quietly vowed to carry the spirit of the festival with them long after the last lantern was extinguished. They spoke of adventures beyond Elderbrook, of markets in distant towns, of ships with billowing sails and cities carved from marble, their ambitions weaving together beneath the pale blue sky like new verses to an old, beloved song. Captain Buttons, the ever-defiant goat, trotted triumphantly past them, oblivious to dreams of distant lands, content in his reign as undisputed festival mascot, his garland now faded, but his legend firmly etched into Elderbrook folklore. And so, life resumed its steady pace. Fields awaited tending, livestock needed feeding, roofs required patching, and the steady hum of routine wrapped itself once more around the village. But beneath the dirt roads and stone cottages, beneath the worn tools and familiar tasks, the echoes of the festival remained. A heartbeat of music, a flash of firelight, the memory of clumsy dances and impossible stories whispered beneath the stars. The Elderbrook Festival would fade into days, then weeks, then seasons, but its imprint would linger in every shared glance, every retold tale, every burst of laughter that caught villagers off guard as they remembered the absurdity, the beauty, and the brief escape carved from the ordinary. And that, my friends, is how the small, muddy, chaotic village of Elderbrook reminds us that joy is rarely perfect. It's messy, loud, full of tripping feet, off-key songs, rebellious goats, and impossible promises whispered at midnight. But it's real. It's ours. And it's worth celebrating every time the banners rise and the fire cracks to life. Now, if you enjoyed walking through this story with me, if you laughed, pictured yourself dodging a runaway cheese wheel, or imagined sharing ale beneath the stars, why not join this little corner of chaos permanently? Hit that subscribe button. Be part of this community where we chase forgotten stories, ridiculous traditions, and the humor tucked between history's folds. Drop a comment below. Tell me where you're from, share your own festival tale, or let me know what part of this wild ride you loved most. I read every single one, and trust me, nothing makes these late-night storytelling sessions better than hearing your voices join the conversation. Until the next adventure, take care of each other, chase joy where you find it, and always, always, watch out for mischievous goats. See you next time.